Hello, good morning or good afternoon, everyone, depending on where you are. I'm Didi Caldwell, President and founder of Global Location Strategies. We are going to talk about the AI power race today, and I'm going to give just another few minutes or a minute or so to let others join. We're really looking forward to this conversation. We have a couple of great guests, and we have, I believe, 230 people that have registered. So it's a big crowd out there, and I think this is going to be a really fascinating discussion. And obviously, you think that too because you've been signing up in record numbers. So, very, very excited and happy about that. So, as we let people come in, I'm just going to go ahead and start framing the conversation somewhat. So, there's a lot of discussion about data centers, and this isn't really a data center conversation. It's more about a decision making moment. So, we tend to talk about data centers in a binary term. So it's a yes or no question. And are data centers good or are they bad? Should we take them or should we not? But that's not actually the decision that's in front of you. The real question is, what are you building your system around right now? And what might you be giving up in the process? So with that, let's get started. So this is what's driving all of this. So we are compressing nearly $1 trillion of data center investment into just a few years. And to be frank, we've never seen anything like this in human history, where this much infrastructure is being compressed in such a short period of time. And you and your communities and everyone can feel that. Land that used to get used, used to sit, it's getting tied up. Power that used to be available is gone. Construction capacity, it's all spoken for. So this isn't gradual growth. It's a system that's being forced to absorb something that it really was not designed for. So what we're seeing is that this old model just no longer works. I've been doing site selection for nearly 30 years, and economic development used to be fairly straightforward. You built sites, you marketed them, and you hope for the right project to show up. And most of the time, you had your requirements on what you wanted, but you really wanted whatever showed up. And that has fundamentally changed. So we no longer can just say we're just going to wait and see what comes. You've got to be thinking about what do you really want before it even shows up. So let me make this a little bit more real for a second. If I want to ask you this question, if you had a fully powered industrial site today and a data center showed up tomorrow, do you know exactly what you would say? We'll talk about that more when we get to the Q&A. And this is not just growth. What's happening right now is different in 4 ways. Number one, it's faster. We are just absorbing projects and load faster than we've ever done before. It's more concentrated. So we've seen certain areas across the country that have absorbed more of this growth than others. And that's definitely starting to change, but the ecosystems and the clustering still exist. It's more capital intensive. These data centers are incredibly capital intensive, and there's just more uncertainty. So demand, timelines, and technology. All of these are uncertain. And the system, whether it's utilities or communities, were not designed to make decisions at this speed. So there's really 3 concentrations right now that is happening underneath all of this. So number one, fuel is more concentrated. We're more dependent on natural gas than we've been in decades. So in the late 90s, natural gas made up about 9 to 11% of our fuel for generation across the country. Now it's in excess of 40%. And when we have things like Winter Storm Uri, and then just recently Winter Storm Fern, we start to see issues with reliability, and cost, which raises cost not just for thermal load, but also for electricity. The other concentration that's happening is that demand is more concentrated. So Kenny and I used to work together in site selection at Fluor. And if we had a project that was, needed 100 acres, was going to employ 100 people, was $100 million in investment and needed, say, 5 megawatts of demand. That was a huge project. Now that is something that we consider easily digestible and a small project. What we're seeing now is that there's 300, 500 megawatts, even a gigawatt of power that's going to one location. And then the third area of concentration is that local economies are being concentrated around a handful of very large projects. So when you're a very small community and $1 billion project shows up, then that completely changes your economy, both from a fiscal standpoint and from an employment standpoint. So when we look across these concentrations, this is not about diversification, it's about correlation. And that correlation is really what creates the volatility. So I'll be the first to tell you that I have no idea where this future goes. We have definitely in our lifetime seen infrastructure that has been built ahead of demand. Think back to the telecom days, even think as recently as the EV infrastructure, and we're seeing some adjustments in that. If you go back in history and you look at the canal systems or you look at railroads, we've seen this sort of boom bust in infrastructure development. Right now, we don't know how this is going to play out for AI. We're sort of at the cutting edge of this. And so 10 years from now, we're probably going to say one of two things. We're either going to say we barely built enough infrastructure fast enough, or we're going to say that we built more than the economy could absorb. And here's the uncomfortable part. Both of these futures are plausible. It's pretty much a coin toss at this point. And the uncomfortable truth is that we are making long-term infrastructure decisions right now based on demand we don't fully understand yet. So the real risk is not that AI fails. We're all using AI in our everyday work. We're, like many of you, we're trying to figure out how to implement it better at our own companies. So we know that AI is coming, but the risk is that infrastructure and demand move at different speeds. And there's also a manufacturing impact. So this is where it becomes very real, and it becomes very real for people like me who are trying to site manufacturing projects. So let's say that there's a 200 megawatt load. One is a data center and one is a manufacturing project. So a 1 cent increase in power costs on a large load of that size is about $17 million a year. For a data center, that's pretty easily digestible. So if you have 200 million users, that's about 9 cents per user. For reference, ChatGPT has about 900 million active users a month. So you can see how the data centers can spread that cost out over many, many users. For manufacturing, that can change whether or not the economics of the project work. So if we assume that the manufacturer is making 200,000 units per year, be they tons or cars or whatever the case might be, that's equivalent to $88 per unit. And that's before you include any of the other inflationary impacts on things like steel and labor that have been caused by data center investment. So this is not theoretical. We're already seeing this play out. Projects not landing, sites taken out of consideration, and power really becoming that first filter, not just on the availability, not just on the cost, not just on the reliability, but all three of those combined together. It's not a future problem. It's happening right now, which means this is no longer just a cost issue. It's an allocation decision. So this is where we're seeing things start to shift. You're seeing places hit pause. Maine right now just passed a moratorium. There are many other states and communities that have pressed pause. There's also been permitting issues where permitting is slowing down, zoning approvals are getting harder, or projects are just getting stuck. And it's not because the communities, or at least the economic developers and the people that manage the finances of the communities, it's not that they don't want growth. It's just that the system is moving faster than our ability to plan for it. Moratoriums are not going to stop the demand. They can just move it. So capital is going to go where it can get power, where it can get the permits, and where it can move quickly. The question is, where do you want to be in that story? I can speak from experience that we were working with an industrial company, not a data center, that was looking at a site in South Carolina. And when we got the initial proposal, they quoted us $90,000 an acre. A few weeks later, we showed up. They called us the day before to tell us that the price for the land had gone up to $180,000 an acre. Same site, same dirt, just more data center interest. So this is just not growth. It's about competition for capacity. And that's forcing a different kind of decision that you just can't take what shows up anymore. So again, this is not about being for or against data centers. That's just way too simple of a question. The real question is what are you choosing to build your system around? And at some point, this becomes a choice, not between good and bad, but between one future and another. Because every commitment you make right now, power, land, infrastructure, it forecloses something else. And once that capacity is committed, it's very, very difficult to reverse that and to get it back. So the question isn't just what's happening, it's how do you make those decisions in a system where demand is uncertain, infrastructure is long-lived, and capacity is already constrained. So that's exactly what I would like to bring into this conversation. And with that, let me introduce my fellow panelists. So joining me today is Dale Rector, an energy consultant at Advantage Energy. Dale brings 27 years of experience in the energy sector, and we at GLS have been very honored to work with Dale on several of our manufacturing projects, including a 1 gigawatt project that we sited in Oklahoma for an aluminum smelter. Dale works at the intersection of grid reality and business strategy every day, which means he's living this conversation in a very real way. Dale, great to have you here.
Thank you, Didi.
Also joining is my friend, Kenny McDonald, who is founder of Little Dry Consulting and recently former president and CEO of One Columbus in Ohio, where over 15 years, his team helped more than 850 companies expand or locate in the region, resulting in over 800,000 jobs and $50 billion in capital investment. So Kenny has really had a front row view to these major location decisions and what they do to a community over time. And that perspective is exactly what this conversation needs. So Kenny, very glad that you are here as well. Thank you for joining.
Thank you for having me.
So, what I'd like to start with is what you're actually seeing on the ground. So Dale, if I could start with you, and I just want to give us a frame of reference. When a project shows up and they got, say, 300, 500 megawatts or even more, and that hits a utility today, what actually happens behind the scenes?
Well, Didi, when a 300 to 500 megawatt load approaches a utility, it triggers a full-scale system planning event. And the utility is the gatekeeper. The utility immediately shifts into risk management mode. Before even doing their system planning, they evaluate whether or not the project is real. So they start validating the load even before they start stress testing the grid. And then it continues on to determining how to serve that load without harming existing customers. So it sets up internal divisions within the utility system, just like it sets up divisions within communities. And what ultimately follows is not a months-long process, but a multi-year process of studies, cost allocation, negotiations, regulatory approvals, and infrastructure build-out. You know, the real constraint isn't willingness, it's physics, you know, and the timelines that are involved and who pays. In most cases, the question isn't, can we serve it, but how long will it take and at what cost and how much risk are we willing to absorb as the utility across our rate base?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that in the long battle between physics and optimism, physics is undefeated. So, you know, in my experience, we used to complain about the natural gas companies all the time because they never gave us a straight answer. And it feels like now that we're in that same situation with the electric utilities, but you know, they're pretty constrained by their regulatory environment, by their availability of capital, you know, rate decisions, et cetera. And I think there's a lot of concern that these costs are being passed on to the ratepayers. So who is actually paying for the infrastructure now, and how has that changed over the last few years?
Yeah, that's an ongoing negotiation process. And And typically the data center pays for all of the incremental cost. A lot of communities and utilities have individually been pushing that. So the infrastructure build out is, as much cost that can be pushed to the data center is being pushed to the data center. And that is very different than what it was 2 or 3 years ago. 2 or 3 years ago, you might have smaller loads. You might have excess capacity. For example, you might have a 15% reserve requirement, and you could bring on a 25 megawatt customer without a lot of system planning and custom ordering equipment and things like that. So who really pays is typically the data center now, because all of the incremental costs are so much higher and the timelines are farther out. So the utility has to have cost recovery for those components so that they don't impact the existing customer base, which is used to a rate structure that is based off of primarily paid down generation assets, and they're not used to the significant cost of capital increase that would push their weighted average cost up. So they try to isolate those large loads and push that onto the new data center versus, previously utilities might be more economic development minded and trust more that they can recover the limited capital cost, or if they did have stranded costs, it could be subsidized across the rest of the rate base more easily. That just functionally cannot happen now. The utility cannot afford to invest in a gigawatt of power that becomes stranded, or 15 miles of transmission line that goes down. The one thing that is harder for states and individual utilities to push back to the data center, though, are system transmission upgrades. And many times, since that's based on FERC, they'll end up being spread over everybody in the customer class in a rate base, instead of being controlled at the state level through the regulatory process for rate making.
Yeah. I mean, for decades, we've been marching along at fairly anemic growth on the demand side with, the decline in manufacturing, but also just with electric efficiency savings. And now through the electrification of just about everything, some large scale manufacturing projects, and now data centers, the demand has really hockey sticked. And I don't think the grid nor the regulatory environment was really built for that kind of hockey stick type load growth. Um, how are you seeing more creative solutions in terms of like behind the meter generation or other options that data center companies are looking to in order to meet their insatiable desire for power electrons now?
Yeah, I think that is a typical reaction of data centers when they come up against a utility and the utility says, "Well, we can't really supply you the power," and the data center will say, "No problem, I'll just generate my own power," and then they find out the real truth, which is that the electricity grid isn't designed for that. So if you want to minimize cost by putting generation on site and not having transmission cost upgrades, you still have to get some sort of fuel to that generator, unless you're lucky enough to be in a renewable, high renewable area. And even that has terrible load factors to be able to supply the flat loads of the industrial. So what they find is they go back to the interstate pipelines and say they want to connect to them and burn gas because that's a base load fuel source. And then the pipelines say, "Are you kidding me? I can't supply that kind of capacity that you would need for your generation." And then the utility comes back and says, "And who's going to provide backup supply?" And the costs just spiral from there. So it's a very sensitive issue. So we're really finding that data center growth is happening in very pocketed regional areas, in power availability
Mm,
regions.
yeah. So Kenny, if I could shift just a second to the community perspective. Um, How often do you think communities fully understand what they're committing to when they pursue projects of this magnitude?
They don't. I'll start there. The discussion's been great so far. I will say that there'll be communities like Northern Virginia. There's some places in Texas over the last decade here in Columbus, Ohio, and some other places that deeply understand what the hyperscalers need. The utilities, the communities have all become fairly sophisticated about how to proceed with the project. They're aware of the decisions they're making, even if this is all evolving under our feet every day. And then there are other places that are now being exposed to all of these decisions for the first time, and they're really behind. And it calls for a huge effort to educate them through their state level economic development entities, through their utility commissions, to get people on the ground to actually help them walk through a myriad of misinformation that may be being promoted by some people, to understand the technical issues that the utilities and the engineers are throwing at them every day. And then ultimately, um, what does it really mean from a revenue standpoint? And while I think there's choices to be made, I'm a big believer in building frameworks. And a lot of our rural locations around the country, in places that have not seen this kind of economic activity, whether it's data centers or manufacturing anything in quite a while, are now on the radar screen for some of these projects. They really need a lot of help. And the clients also need good guidance, and folks like Didi and Dale walking them through the process, because they often don't know what kind of impact this is going to have on the community either. And they've just been asked to build capacity and are moving quickly as well. So I think at the end of the day, this is going to make us all better. It's going to make communities and states' economic development planning a ton better. But I will say it's a very messy time that's going to require everybody to kind of lock arms.
Mm-hmm. And I think you see sort of knee-jerk reactions in one way or the other. Either communities are extremely, I'll say, euphoric about the prospects of getting a data center because what it can mean for their tax base, which is really critical in some areas, particularly that have maybe been underserved previously. But then there's a lot of skepticism. So I talked about Maine, but there's a lot of other places which are rejecting the notion of developing data centers. And what do you think is really driving that level of fear in some communities?
Well, you said it when you started this session, Dee, that this is really not about data centers. This is about kind of a national mistrust of major institutions, of technology companies, and big entities like utilities and the energy industry itself and stuff. That's all coming to the surface now. Um, that's something that's slowly being overcome. I can point to, a document that Kansas put together, and I think Milwaukee's done a great job on their site of educating and helping their community wade through the misinformation that may be being thrown at them. At the same time, I think it's appropriate to acknowledge that people in your community are going to have questions. These are very complex projects. The numbers and the zeros attached to these things are enormous. And so it's rational for people to want to have answers and not be left in the dark. Um, I'll say two things at the end of this. I think there's movements to bring more transparency to this process. I think we want to be careful about that because we still need people to do business in our states and our communities, and non-disclosure agreements, things like that, that protect these public companies, the investor-owned utilities, things like that is going to be important for any kind of project going forward. Um, and second is, um, I want to make sure that um, the communities understand that the decisions they're making around that may hurt them in some other ways. A moratorium is essentially a failure and shows that your team isn't ready to compete for data centers or perhaps any kind of project. If you have to call a timeout and retreat and take 6 months off, that's not going to work for any kind of economic development growth. And so it's a call to arms to do planning, to get your people together, to have sessions with your community, but to roll up your sleeves and make this a priority. And too often that's not been the case over the last several decades.
Yeah, that's very insightful. And I think that's a great segue into the second part of our discussion, which is really about the tension that exists between manufacturing and data centers. So you said it yourself that the skepticism or NIMBYism that we're seeing is not just around data centers, it's around growth in general. And so we also see it impacting large manufacturing projects or residential developments. I mean, it's kind of across the board. From the cost perspective, at what point, and since you've been through this in the Columbus region and New Albany, at what point does data center growth start to change who can actually afford to operate in a region? And is there a point where industries just quietly stop showing up because it's too expensive?
Yes and no. I think that the infrastructure that's being built out, in some cases for the first time in 50 or 60 years in some areas around the country, is certainly caused a lot more debate. If you're a private developer, the dream would be to have 1,000 acres and put a data center on a piece of it and then build out the infrastructure for the rest of things so you can diversify and have everything. Um, Fact is that it does increase property prices. It does increase property choices. Like it really brings a lot of competition to the market. A lot of people flood in. There's always pretenders when that happens,
Mhm.
and some speculators that sort of make the market. You can't figure out the market for a while, and then after a while, that the big players sort of take over, and you start to get more rational decisions. I have seen, in my experience is that it's brought manufacturing to most of the locations where that infrastructure has been developed, either adjacent to or even nearby. If you're building transmission and substations and you're maybe attaching to pipelines and things like that, you're bringing gas to gas deserts and things like that. You're opening up some ground that without this forcing function, would have not been tenable for a manufacturing or other investment for decades. And it's bringing that all forward, which is also causing the rapidity of this is actually causing everybody um, to really want to take a breath and maybe take a couple of steps back. The fact is, there's no timeouts though. You just have to hunker down and work through it. So I think there's great uh, opportunity for investment, and the infrastructure that you're bringing is going to probably catalyze more investment. And those communities and states that lean into the growth will be better off a decade from now.
Yeah. I was at the Port of Little Rock site last fall and we sited Trex in the Port of Little Rock industrial area a few years ago. And we were sort of at the bleeding edge of that site and where the infrastructure was. And there's a data center that's going in there now that has essentially financed the infrastructure to bring a lot of power into that site, not just for the data center, but also for other properties. So I think that's a good example of where you can leverage those investments to make you more competitive for other types of projects as well.
I will add one thing is that you do see some customers wanting to be close to it as well. Never forget that our manufacturers are increasingly running on the technology that's in some of these AI centers. So if you're
Mhm.
actually going a little bit further and saying, actually, how does one make the other better and more competitive? I think the regions that are thinking that far ahead are really separating themselves from the crowd now.
Yeah, and they're both on the demand and the supply side. So
Yes.
this is another phenomenon that we see is that a lot of the incremental demand of our manufacturing clients is being driven by data center development. And so they're trying to increase production at the same time data centers are expanding, which is great for them because they have more customers, they have more demand. But it's difficult for them to find the land, the EPC capacity, the power, the water in order to be able to meet that demand. Dale, from a power cost and infrastructure standpoint, are manufacturers already getting priced out in certain regions?
Well, let me say first that I agree with Kenny's position that that a decade from now we'll all be better off, and I do believe that bringing infrastructure into the area at the cost of the data centers is really going to provide a long-term benefit. In fact, if you think about adding a gigawatt size data center to an area, if you still have that same 15% reserve requirement, you just added 150 megawatts to your reserve system that can now be used to, bring in 25, 30 megawatt industrial loads and then replaced over time to get that reserve capacity back. That said, I think it's going to be very painful for industrials and communities, all customer classes between now and that 10-year mark when we see the ultimate benefit. I mean, we are seeing investments, for example, in Texas in going from 365 to 765 kV systems, which cost twice as much, but they can move 5 times as much power. So there are these long-term benefits that communities and manufacturers ultimately will be able to see. But the reality is that the MISO and the PJM and the ERCOT capacity prices are all through the roof right now. And it's because in part of how the wholesale power system is structured. In PJM, a utility has to submit all their generation into the wholesale market and then basically buy back from the wholesale market. So they do own those generating assets and they own the transmission assets, but the regional transmission organizations have a lot of control over making a market for wholesale power and for transmission services. And one of those things is a capacity auction. So a utility may have to bid into a capacity auction that has moved from $60 a megawatt day to over $600 a megawatt day. And that ripples through the regulated rate structure down to all customer classes as it gets to that point where the total costs that the utility incurs gets allocated between the customer classes and the rates. And that's why we see record rate cases right now from utilities like Florida Power and Light. So yes, it's going to be expensive for the next 5 years because the existing customers have to pay for that build out as the incremental build out as before the data centers get online and start really providing revenue. And there's only so much you can take in an upfront contribution and aid to construct from those entities. So it just invariably works its way into higher prices for everyone in the short term.
And again, just like the grid was not built for hockey stick demand, the capacity market and the way that that's structured wasn't really, it was meant more for a demand load, a load that looked kind of up and down, just depending on what was happening with weather and all kinds of other things. And right now it's trying to digest on an ongoing basis this increased demand.
If you had a gigawatt of industrial customers, say you had 10 100 megawatt customers or 20 50 megawatt industrial customers, some of those would be up and down. So your coincident peak on the grid would not be 1,000, right? It would be somewhere around 700, 750. So you have that inherent protection in the system that when the residential customer loads swing up in the summer or in the winter due to cooling or heating demand, that reserve capacity, that coincident peak is there in addition to what the utility's reserve requirement is, and we kind of squeak through. But when you add 1,000 megawatts base load that doesn't have flexibility, it creates a tightening of all of the capacity resources. And when you have those swings, you have sharper price spikes in the wholesale market, and you have more frequent times when the price is over, say, $100 a megawatt hour. And when you have higher price spikes and a few more frequent price spikes, even if the average energy price isn't moving up more than, say, 10%, what ends up happening is those extreme periods work their way through that fuel cost adjustment and can have a disproportionate impact on the rates for customers, like we saw in Uri or even in Fern here recently. I mean, everyone knows that there electric bills are going up. Part of that is driven by the sensitivity of the system and the addition of large flat loads that are not flexible enough to be able to drop back. And so that drives pricing higher on the wholesale market, which the utilities are ultimately exposed to.
Yeah, I remember a day when your large load factor projects were the darlings of the utilities because that was
Yes.
base load that they could rely on. And those were like your manufacturing, 24/7, 360-day a year type operations, things like petrochemical plants or aluminum smelters. And now that load looks very similar to a data center load. And so what we saw with Project Phoenix and the aluminum smelter is that in some cases we were falling, that the rate structure was changing such that large load factor projects have higher rates and more upfront capital commitments because of what you said. They're trying to get the data centers to pay for the infrastructure upfront. And whereas a data center has, they're pretty, they have lots of money to spend.
They
And
do.
it's more about timing than it is about cost. Whereas a manufacturer who's looking at operating a facility over the next 50 years under very thin margins just can't accept that level of increase in cost.
That's absolutely correct. And we are seeing that, you said, are we seeing customers, industrial customers not show up? I think we're seeing industrial customers that are failing to expand in a number of areas. I think that's phantom lost load for communities and jobs that that industrial customers can't expand. They're in cost cutting mode because of energy prices. And unfortunately, labor and investment in new projects and things is that's the cut point that
Mhm.
I'm seeing, at least anyway.
Yeah. So let me ask
And
both of you. Kenny, I'll go to you first. Is there a version where data centers and manufacturing can coexist, or are these fundamentally in tension?
No, 100%. I'm not nearly as smart at this as Dale. The way I understand it is, there was a time when the biggest machine in the world was the United States energy grid. And now China is well surpassed that over the last decade and now runs the biggest machine in the world. Turns out that machine wasn't very well suited for dynamic growth. And the parts that go into that, the transmission lines, um, were not a whole lot different than what they were 75 years ago. And so you're replacing that stuff in some cases with some uh, new technologies. Even the transmission lines themselves, think about all the manufacturing components that have to go into them and the transformers and everything that has to be built, presumably in this country, so that we can actually control it and make sure that the systems are all in place. Like that's creating a manufacturing boom without it. Um, it it's making up without data center construction, industrial construction would be down 13% this past year. So this is not only creating growth itself, but it's creating the components and everything that goes into this build out to serve AI and what we have on our phones and what we're trying to run in our companies is creating a manufacturing boom. And so not only should it create manufacturing opportunity, it has to create manufacturing opportunity if we're going to rebuild this machine and make it the best in the world, so that we have a strategic advantage over time. And I'll just repeat that if we make these investments, both in the grid, as well as those islands, those independent power producers that are going to be married to some of these centers for as big as 5 gigawatts and stuff in some cases, we're going to be we're going to graduate to being an even more dominant economic player over the next 10 years if we will work together. It's going to require a lot of work, and it's going to require us to answer a lot of questions from stakeholder groups and to wade through a lot of policy that has not been updated in decades.
Hmm. Yeah, we're running a 21st century economy on a 20th century grid.
Yeah.
And Kenny, you and I spent a lot of time citing merchant natural gas plants back in the late 90s and early 2000s when they were more peaking plants. So they weren't base load. They were peaking plants. Natural gas was a lot more expensive back then. And so it wasn't the lowest cost of power. But even then, people were talking about we need to modernize the grid. That was 30 years ago. And here we are, and we're still talking about we need to modernize the grid. And I would argue that we need to modernize our regulatory system as well. It just wasn't built for this type of change and under such a tight period of time. So for this last piece, it really, oh, I'm sorry, Dale, go ahead.
I just wanted to agree with you, Didi. I think I think that there has to be a marrying of manufacturing and AI data centers. I think that is what keeps us, in our position in the world. And so I do believe that there is a future where they work together and they do need to work together. And there are a number of things that we need to do, like change some of the policies in regards to expanding natural gas pipelines and potentially reducing the time that it takes for regional transmission organizations to approve generation in queues, and changing fundamentally how we have a change in the wind of energy generation based on a political climate, who's in office. We're talking about long-term investments that outlive even the champion in the community that pushed for that, right? Everything is long-term oriented, and we have to design our regulatory system and our recruitment system and our grid to handle long-term improvements. So I, for one, am willing to take the pain over the next, 8 years or so to get to that 10-year in advance future, as long as we're just pushing behind it and we're supporting it in a
Mm.
collective way.
So while we're on the topic of talking about what we should do in the future, so what should economic developers and even manufacturers, utilities do? And after this, as soon as we wrap up here, we're going to take some questions from the audience. If you have those, just put those in the chat. Kenny, you said you're big on frameworks. So you're an EDO, you're in a small community, a 400 megawatt project shows up. What are the first questions you ask before you say yes?
Well, first of all, listen intently. Ask, don't take anything for granted. And those of us that have been at this a while, what a utility told you last week, you could probably go a site visit a week or two later and bring that same data to the table. You can't do that anymore. It's super dynamic, right? You're gonna have to know, can you still deliver and can you make promises? And you're really going to have to work more closely with your utilities. Same is true for utilities. They're going to have to work more closely with communities, share more information, make sure that if they want to pursue a project and want to say yes, that they can say yes. That's going to require a lot more debate. That doesn't mean retreating. It does require a little more work though before just kind of from the hip saying we want growth. On the other side, you have to decide what, maybe you're not willing to do under some circumstances and what you're willing to say yes to. And then, like everything else now, continuous education is going to be uh, really important. The world changed November 30th, 2022, when ChatGPT came out. Data centers were kind of a non-topic, nice to have. There was some
It was
growth,
more about crypto back then.
and then you just kind of took this off, and the energy intensity and this debate really started then. And every year since then, it's continued to change, and policies are being changed, and frameworks are being changed at the Utilities Commission and stuff like that. You unfortunately going to have to lean into that and be an expert, stay up late at night studying some of it so that you can be the trusted advisor both to your community and to those clients. And for site selectors, they're getting, I'd say they also had an education to go through, that it wasn't just, hey, every community is going to want our projects. We're going to have to do this in a nuanced way so that we introduce the opportunity to communities in the right way, very carefully, and that we proceed. And it may take a little more time, but the gain of that could be enormous for both the client and the community.
Mm. Yeah, I kind of think of this as so we've done a lot of siting for Chinese projects over the years, going back many years. And at some point, it became politically unpopular, and there were communities and states that pretty much shut the door. And I see that happening now with data centers. They're shutting the door. It doesn't mean the investment isn't going to happen, it's just going to happen elsewhere. Now, on the Chinese side, elsewhere might be another country, or it could just be another state that's still open for business. I think data centers are in the US for lots of reasons, but they're going to migrate to those places. And so sounds kind of like what you're saying too is don't wait for a 400 megawatt project to show up. Do your homework now and be prepared to answer that question when they arrive.
100%.
Yeah. So Dale, what should communities be asking the utilities that they're not asking today, and what should often be negotiated today that often isn't?
Yeah, I'll start with,
From the community's perspective.
yeah. From the community's perspective, I agree with Kenny. They have to, the communities need to be sincerely educated on the impact of energy. It is a local decision. You know, you property taxes improve in one area, but it is a regional impact. So I think the communities need to ask questions of the utility well in advance, and of their state regulators, and lobby their state legislatures to get favorable positions, or at least clear positions on things like who's going to take the risk, and um, how are how are risks going to be allocated, and what is the actual timeline to get things put into place. So I think where economic development folks can come into play, and what kind of gets missed in this, is that in that battle between who pays for it, does the ratepayer pay for it? Does the utility pay for it? Does the community pay for it? Does the data center pay for it? We forget about the state. I think one of the things that needs to happen is that um, communities need to work with the state to intentionally look at energy in the incentive package. And typically, the incentive package has been left to just what's the utility going to offer. It's all in their ball court, right? But these projects are so long. Um, we need to start working with the state as an intermediary to help shift part of that risk off, either in reducing regulatory risk or providing financial insight.
Hmm, interesting.
I'll
So
add,
go ahead.
I wanted to add to that. There are some very good ways to protect the customer from um, paying inflated rates that are emerging, and we've cleaned up queues in the utilities commissions and in the grid system. There's been so much positive reform going on around the country. Um, there's ways to cap property taxes for the residential customers that you have in given areas through coordinated action, things like that. And make sure that that doesn't, price somebody out of their home or out of their community, or, unintentionally hurt those that are the most vulnerable in our communities. There's really good ways to do that now, and there's some policy decisions that are being made, I think, that are really great. I wanted to say this for a while in this conversation. A data center, particularly like something like a gigawatt or something, is not equal to a normal manufacturing facility. Done correctly with a great incentive package and an agreement with the community, it can yield, the revenue of dozens of manufacturing projects. And so trying to say that there's one is just like the other from a revenue standpoint is also not true. And that's not always immediately visible or transparent to community leaders or elected officials until you really get out the spreadsheets and kind of go through something. Once you do that, it makes things a little different, because numbers, just like everything else, is matters a lot. Revenue sources can be drastically different, doubling and tripling school budgets and county budgets and things like that.
Yeah,
Yes.
I'm gonna I'm going to
Let
throw
me
out
let me ask you a
something.
closing question, and I think because I think you might be going there, Dale, is before we move to questions from the audience, I want to ask, what's one mistake that you're seeing right now that it might be very hard for communities to undo? Or on the flip side, what's one of the things that you're seeing that they're doing very smartly that will benefit them in the future?
Um, I think mainly it's just understanding the timeline, how long it takes, and in part um, failing to make a long-term transition plan. Like I said, some of these projects outlive, even just getting them across the finish line. I'm not talking about the duration of how long it's going to be in the community, but just getting it across the finish line, being multiple years, can sometimes exceed the career spans of some of the utility personnel involved, or some of the political leaders that are involved. So I think having something codified and having an agreed upon framework to bring these loads on, and how you're going to manage the risk of that. Um, I think that's the biggest issue that I see. I'm going to say one other thing that might be kind of crazy. I do keep seeing states and communities protecting the rate base, and I like that, because I want to protect the rate base as well. But you're just constraining the utility more and more and more when you do that. I would like to see, and this is going to be really outside the box, but I'd like to see a mechanism where some of these regulated utilities can earn more than their regulated rate of return if they were to step up and do more, if their investors would do more towards bringing a project online. Can they earn more than their regulated rate of return? Because these are high risk for the utility. This is a high risk, low reward scenario. And how do we incent them to take on that risk? Otherwise, we're going to have scenarios like First Energy's president, which says, "Well, if you want them to come here, Governor, you we're not in the business of subsidizing power costs. That's we're in the business of regulated return, and it's going to take what it takes. And if the governor wants it different, the governor can do that. We don't want those politically divisive conversations. We want smooth plans and communities working together, because what one community gets in property taxes, other communities end up paying in elevated electricity costs, and there needs to be some recognition of that. So I think there needs to be more of a multi-community approach, particularly when it comes to affecting these regulatory changes."
Kenny, what do you think? What should we
I,
either stop doing or do differently or continue doing?
I think on the community side, go and see it. It's just like everything else. Go see what these look like. I mean, for a long time, the hyperscalers, and they're still, they don't want people just wandering through their facilities and stuff like that. But there are places you can go to go see what this actually looks like. Ask questions of the communities that work with them to understand their needs, the things that they've done and learn over time, in Northern Virginia, or here in Columbus, or in Dallas. Like, how are you working with those communities? What are the pros and cons, and what are lessons learned and stuff like that? They're happy to share, and I think we got to do that a lot more, so that we're not constantly in a relearning phase. Like, we're learning from those lessons, and we're sharing them widely across our states, or even our grids. For the hyperscalers, for the clients, for them to understand the needs of the community. Don't expect that it's like 10 years ago where everybody's just going to be happy to see you. You know that you're going to enter a fairly tenuous situation, and there's going to be lots of debate. But you do have to intentionally understand the needs of the state, the community, uh, and the things that they're quite frankly, this is just one of the changes going on in the world. So they're worried about the
Really?
impact of AI, and their unemployment rates, and where their revenue bases come from in the past, and what's going to look like 5 and 10 years from now. I'm a little less concerned about the stranded asset thing, because we have stranded assets in manufacturing and office buildings and everything else, that are a lot harder to reuse than an energy facility. right? Or something that has substations and wires and everything attached to it that you can build around. Like I'm far less concerned about stranded assets from a community standpoint. That if you take a risk here and it doesn't quite work out a decade from now, my strong expectation is if you have the energy, you're gonna be able to attach GDP to that, as opposed to it just being a stranded box, a distribution center or something like that. Maybe a much better use for your land.
Yeah, we saw that with the fiber that was built out, the late 90s, early 2000s, and it got ahead of the demand. And so it just laid there and became dark fiber for quite a while. And there were obviously companies that suffered greatly from that, MCI WorldCom probably being the poster child of that. But eventually that fiber became the backbone for what we're doing today. So it was a stranded asset. There were people that invested in that and didn't get a return or lost their money, but ultimately it became an asset for the communities that had that infrastructure that had been built there. The one thing that I will say too is that, in addition to just thinking ahead of time and making sure that your community understands what you're trying to do and that you're never going to change the mind of some of the critics, but focus on building a coalition. Be proactive about what your plan is for your community, not just for data centers, but for growth in general, and control your sites. So we did a project in Missouri a few years ago to identify large industrial sites. We identified a site, it's privately held, and the owner sold it to a data center speculator. And so now, not only can the data center is not coming. And maybe it'll come at some point. But in the meantime, the community has lost the ability to attract investment and jobs of any kind because it's being held by the hands of a private developer who's waiting for a customer to come. So I know that budgets and all of that constrains communities, but when possible, make sure that you can control your assets. So um, that's all the questions that I had. We have about 3 minutes left, so let me take a couple here from the audience. Um, so a couple people asked for some concrete examples of communities that have used successful policy decisions to protect residents from increased rates and property taxes, but also leverage power availability to attract large data centers. Can you call out some specific examples where you've seen that be successful?
I'll hesitate on giving exact coordinates on some of these, but I will say that some communities, as they're negotiating their deals and they're looking at their pilot agreements, things like that, and they're looking at the revenue that will be created from these projects, and they're locking those in, have started to talk about decreasing taxes overall for their existing residents. So it's bringing in so much revenue over a period of time, and it's so predictable that they're actually able to either stabilize or even reduce taxes at a local level in some cases. Obviously, that minimizes some of the opposition because everybody's usually, for that, and it actually is a really good strategy, and that's actually happening. And I've got a few communities around the country that are looking at that. Um, I know that there's a question there. Have you built manufacturing around it? Here in Ohio, the New Albany Business Park is maybe example number one of, you located some data centers. It brought in infrastructure. It brought in tradespeople who knew how to build complicated things. That helped us attract Intel to the site. It's attracted over $2 billion from Amgen for a biotech facility and other manufacturing around the area. And it has been a real catalyst for some of these longer term manufacturing things. So it's a perfect example of that. I know there's a lot of other places in the country that's happening as well.
Yeah. There's a question here about, we've been talking about 400 or 500 megawatts, but how about those that are a gig to a gig and a half? And then kind of related to that is a question about SMRs, the small modular reactors on the nuclear side. I'm going to go to Dale on this one, but I will say that Kairos is a customer. We work with Kairos on siting of their engineering and testing facilities, and also work with them in Oak Ridge to site their Hermes test reactors, and they've signed a deal with Google for 500 megawatts. of power. The Hermes 2 reactor in Oak Ridge was going to be the first grid-connected test reactor, but that is now being redirected to Google's use. And they broke ground on that, I believe, last week. So, Dale, how would you any of your answers change if this were a gig or a gig and a half size data center, and where do SMRs fit in that?
So, I mean, a gig and a half right now in the US would probably go in Texas. You know, that's where you have primarily natural gas to serve. I do believe in SMRs. I think they still have a long way to go to be economical. They're already being used in China and Russia. I think internationally, you're going to see them grow up internationally and then be transitioned to the US. And it will be that second wave. I think there is a golden age for small modular nuclear reactors. I think our population needs to accept the fact that small nuclear reactors are not any more inherently dangerous than any other type of, generation technology or some of the other technologies we have, like natural gas pipeline explosions that we experience. So I mean, it's been a
Well, and the
long
environmental
time.
impacts too, right? Because although
Absolutely.
gas is a relatively clean gas fuel when you compare it to coal, it still emits NOx and VOCs, which are precursors to ozone. And if we're talking about doubling the U.S. fleet, that is a significant impact, where SMRs don't have that same impact.
Yeah, I think the everything happens at a pilot program, right? One utility has to do it, and then a couple other utilities will do it. It'll propagate through the public service commissions. It has to work its way through a fairly long adoption process. But I think economically, in 10 years, they will be very cost competitive and will have clean power related to them. And I really like it from the standpoint of distributed generation. What I don't want to do, and what seems to be a trend, I would like to see utilities manage that, because utilities have better oversight than private companies. I don't have any problem with private companies building them and selling them to utilities and making a ton of money doing that. But the operational aspect of it, I at least initially, I would like to see that in more regulated hands, just to smooth the adoption process. I think it's very difficult for a private entity to say that they're operating a nuclear unit, as safe as it may be, and expect not to have public scrutiny on them. So.
Yeah, great. Well, we are about 2 minutes over, and we have a ton of questions that we never got to. So I want to thank my panelists, but just in closing, I want to say that, for you out there that are navigating this climate right now, growth is coming either way. And the question is just how you steward it. And I think you heard from the panelists here that manufacturing and AI data centers can coexist. And so, figuring out how to steward that, prepare ahead of time, think about how you can leverage that infrastructure. And, we see you. That's a lot of responsibility. So building your community's future while also managing this constrained capacity and competing priorities and rising skepticism within your community, it's all hard work, but I really do believe this is exactly the kind of moment you're built for. And never in the history of my career have economic developers and the work that you do been so front and center of what everybody's thinking about. And so I would just like to thank you for joining us. This will be available on YouTube in a couple of days. So thanks for sticking with us, and have a great day.
Thank you.